is an expert in crossing boundaries. And I think that what our intention was from the very beginning of the Anthropology of Travel, Tourism and Pilgrimage, which we started in SOAS, was that we wanted to provide a framework, a discourse, if you like, of how to cross boundaries. And I think Luke personifies that, whether it's, as Jeff said, writing, music, food, language, generation, and so on. And I think it's also great to see our professional colleagues like Nelson Grayburn, Jonathan Skinner, Christian Nasser, and Linda Covington and Safet, of course, together, and also to welcome other students and colleagues from all over the world. And I think the idea of staying hybrid, which is basically what Jeff said, is something that we want to continue. Without further ado, therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce Luke Pienson. Luke.
Thank you. Cool. Everyone can see this GIF, which is some real footage from my life on tour. So I, along with my collaborator, Alex, who is here today. Hi, Alex. I'm putting together a book that is meant to kind of get at some truths about the lives of touring musicians, using food as the window in. So food is going to be a major part of what I talk about today, but the main idea is to look at music and music studies and the lives of touring musicians from like a mobility lens, because mobility prior to the pandemic is kind of the main thing that characterizes what we do professionally, because we have to. Touring is the main source of income for most musicians who are operating on a professional level. And it has to be that way in part because we plainly don't really make money from recorded music. And growing up during kind of the advent of streaming, or just when iTunes started charging 99 cents per song, and during Napster and file sharing and all of that, I was kind of conditioned from a young age to never expect that recorded music was a viable source of income, or even that music was really a viable career path at all. And now that I actually have been working in music for several years, you would think that maybe it's changed, but it's only been reinforced, especially as companies like Spotify have become more and more powerful. I think a lot of musicians like myself continue to believe, or almost be gaslit by companies like Spotify, that our recorded music actually isn't worth anything. And that's very easy to perpetuate when you get paid half of a penny per stream, or it sounds even worse when you phrase it as 0.006 cents per stream, or whatever it is. It's something like that. So because of that, we go on tour for as much as 200, 250 nights. Some bands do more than that per year. And that forms the basis of our professional activity. And as has been discussed in the very scant writing on music tours in the anthropology realm, it forms like the main basis of our identity. So obviously over the past 16 months, I think a lot of musicians, such as myself, have struggled with even feeling like working musicians, because if you're not touring, you're not traveling, and you're totally static, how could it be that you're working as a musician? Because the two things are just so tied together. So anyway, a few months ago, or several months ago now, I started thinking about putting some of these ideas in writing, almost as an archival project, because as with many different sectors of society, I think there was a hope that maybe after the pandemic, insofar as there is an after, the touring industry and the music industry might evolve a little bit, and maybe bands won't need to tour as heavily as they traditionally have. And maybe recorded music will once again become sort of another source of income, or a better source of income than it is now. And maybe it's a good idea to kind of get down some ideas on what touring, used to be like while we have this time off. what it seems like is going to happen is that nothing is going to change at all, as in many sectors of society. Touring will continue on just as it always has, except that maybe you won't be going to certain countries as they experience outbreaks or whatever it is, even states in the US. But at the same time, I think this still is an archival project to try and get down some ideas about what our lives are like on tour and what they can tell us about just human society, generally the human experience. And I think to show people that there are more resonant themes going on in our lives than they might think, that we can all connect to, and that people might actually connect to the experiences that we have on a daily basis, which are quite a bit less glamorous and quite different than have traditionally been portrayed by popular media or just in the popular imagination. So you'll see a lot of basically the format of this presentation is going to be a handful of case studies that come from the interviews that Alex and I have conducted for this book project, which I should also mention is not an anthropology monograph. It's not really occurring within that framework. It's not strictly academic framework at all. And it's not within an institutional framework either. It's just two guys writing a book. However, or editing a book, I should say, collecting a book. But there are anthropological insights to be drawn, as always, from all of these. We're going to get into some of that. But at the end, I'm going to be really curious to hear what people kind of find resonant or surprising or not surprising in our pitch to people that we are hoping will contribute, and also to people who are hoping will publish our book. We're describing this project as both myth making, that's a big thing, obviously, and myth busting, right? So helping to create new myths or add fuel to existing myths about touring culture, but also to kind of bust myths that we feel are misplaced or incorrect about what we do. So, all right, that's enough of the banana, but this really gives you a great kind of front row seat to what being on tour might feel like. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote from somebody that we interviewed. I'm keeping these quotes anonymous just because of the work in progress nature of what we're working on. But I will give some kind of like vague background information on these people's relationship to touring. And all of the photos, I should mention, none of them are good, but they are all photos that I have taken on tour over the years. So I'll read it. This really struck me. I mean, this just struck so many things that it was almost as if we had paid him to say this, which I assure you we didn't. But he says, "You're always hungry on tour. You don't want to get too filled up before playing a show. At least for me, it's like a disaster. Like, let's have a lasagna 2 minutes before playing. But you never want to have a big or substantial meal before a show. At least that's my experience. And then the show's over and it's like midnight. And where are you going to eat? It's so hard. You spend tour hungry. Tour is like, how am I going to figure out how to get a good meal at these weird hours? And tour is survival mode in so many ways. And it's such a privilege to be able to be on tour. It's such a luxury that you can only kind of talk about tour with other people that have toured. Because if not, you sound like a total ungrateful asshole, you know, as opposed to just an asshole." He was being kind of funny there. But the implication that musicians are uncomfortable or feel like it's taboo to discuss certain kind of negative aspects of what we do is something that resonates certainly with me, and that we've heard other musicians we've spoken to bring up over and over again. It's like, we do have an amazing privilege to be able to do this. But it doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of things about the lifestyle that are difficult, and those are the things that I'm most interested in kind of peeling the curtain back on and getting into, although you will see some examples of positive aspects of the lifestyle too. And the photo is a roadside place in Wisconsin that I remember having a pretty good grilled cheese at. Next slide. So these are some broad themes that I want people to keep in mind as we go through the case studies. And some of them have been touched on. So like I said, there have been a couple straight ahead anthropological studies of touring musicians. Really, there have been two. And there's a monograph that came out last year, or maybe even this year, by Anna Lisa Ramella, who's at University of Cologne. However, it is only in German, so I haven't been able to read it. Hopefully, and I think it will be translated into English. It's called Auf Tour mit Bands, so on tour with bands. But she has some articles in English that you can access. One of which is called, what is it? Finding One's Rhythm. The other one is called Sonic Dwellings. If anybody's interested, I can, send them to Jeff and Tom and Safet, and they can forward them along. But what Anna has worked on really focuses on what she refers to as rhythmic placemaking, which I think is a really beautiful term, about how musicians kind of construct a home for themselves on the road in many different ways. One of the most resonant things she writes about is how setting up the stage for your performance, each band member setting up their own part of the stage is kind of it's that person's way of creating a home, a temporary home for themselves, a place where they feel comfortable, a place that feels static, even though the venue in which they're doing it and the city in which they're doing it, and even the country in which they're doing it changes from night to night. And that can be so disorienting, of course, that this rhythmic placemaking, as she calls it, is one of the few things that kind of keeps things feeling comfortable and familiar. And another thing she writes about is what she calls sonic dwellings, or again, like a home that we create for ourselves through performing, and the kind of trance state that if you're lucky, you can achieve in a performance where you're not really thinking about all those other things I mentioned. You're not thinking about, I'm in this kind of weird venue where, the audience energy isn't there, or I don't know what I'm going to have for dinner. I'm always thinking about that, but not everybody is. If you get into that trance state, you've constructed kind of a sonic home for yourself, and that's the dwelling that you're inhabiting. So I think that's really great. It's really resonant. And reading those things for the first time somewhat recently, it was cool to see those ideas treated with the academic seriousness that, as someone who has experienced them, I feel like they deserve. And then so the only other person who's really written on touring musicians from this standpoint is Andre Novoa, who tagged along on tour with a band of from what I could understand, were amateur musicians on tour around Europe. It's a good piece of writing. He writes a lot about how, and again, both of these are through the mobility lens. So it really touches on how like our identities are just so tied to being on the move all the time. So from that standpoint, it's really helpful and really resonant. But there's some things that are in that piece that I disagree with. He says something like, tours are void of intercultural contact, is the quote that I wrote down in my notes here. That I completely disagree with that, and it's not what I've experienced at all, and not what anybody that we've spoken to for this project has reported back either. Certainly there are musicians in there, and this is an interesting thing about this profession, right, is that I view the travel aspect of going on tour as a huge perk of the job, so to speak, but there are plenty of musicians who traveling is the worst part of what they do, and they wish that they didn't have to go on tour. And there are many things about traveling that are a constant challenge for them. And that the whole spectrum from where I'm at to where those people at, that whole spectrum is represented among musicians, of course. But to suggest that even for those people who are not, enjoying themselves on the road or whatever, who don't enjoy the traveling aspect, to suggest that their experience is void of intercultural contact is just, it's just not true. It's impossible to fully insulate yourself from other cultures while you're traveling for any reason. But an interesting thing about what we do is that, there are plenty of people who end up in places because of music that they may not have otherwise ended up in. And the way that we travel is very different than leisure travelers, although if you're lucky, there are elements of leisure. And it's also very different than any other type of business traveler because of as I think I wrote in the little explanatory paragraph that I wrote for this thing, the constraints of time performance, all of these things make what we do different. And the schedules that we have to, adhere to on tour are really different than, I'm really struggling to think of any other type of business traveler who experiences similar things. Frequently truck drivers, and Novoa actually does compare touring musicians to truck drivers. Truck drivers and flight attendants come up a lot as kind of, cousin professions of what we do. But yeah, it's really its own thing. So some other disciplines that we can look at apart from mobility, obviously human geography, anthropology, sociology. There's the music studies thing, pop music studies, and music traditionally, I'm going to try to not spend too much time on all of this before I get into the case studies, but what, both Ramela and Novoa write about this, but music is so often treated as kind of this like static thing and just written about from this music studies realm that does not take into account that for most musicians, the defining characteristic of what we do is moving around and performing for audiences around the world. And we view what we do as anything but static. And we feel sometimes reading music studies pieces that everything is happening in a vacuum where we're just kind of sitting at home making our art for people to pick apart and then pick apart the social processes that are set into motion by our art. And that's all important, and that is a realm that needs to exist. But it almost completely ignores touring. And I think that's where this comes in. And then to bring it to food, which is my particular kind of interest and my window in to all of these ideas, I think for the project that Alex and I are working on, I have gotten a lot of inspiration from this particular book called Eating Mud Crabs in Kandahar, which is, I think it's UC Berkeley Press. The author is Matt McAllister, the editor. It is an anthology of pieces of food writing by war correspondents from the ground in conflict zones. And all of the essays explore kind of greater truths and greater ideas about the human condition using food as the way into those stories. So, there's one story I'm thinking of where like American soldiers steal an Afghan farmer's cow and butcher it and make steaks because they're so sick of the MREs that the army provides them. But the local Afghans find out, and the American soldiers, the US Army had to pay like a multi-$1,000 settlement to the Afghan farmers because they, kidnapped and killed their cow. Little things like that. Those are the kinds of stories that like we're hoping to tease out from our interview subjects on food and touring. And then there's one other book that has been influential for us, which is called You and I Eat the Same. That came out in 2018. And that is a book that's really, it centers on immigration and how the free circulation of people and ideas has been so important to the development of food culture around the world. And that's another thing that, we feel really resonates with the work we're doing. The free circulation of ideas, arts, music, food, that has been so kind of constricted by the pandemic is more important than ever to recognize. And so that's what we're trying to do. And again, I'm kind of talking about this as if I am setting out to like do the monograph on this, and I'm not really, but it's not to say that down the line, this project won't shapeshift into that, because I think there is a void that that does need to be filled. So the next slide, I'm just going to go through a few terms that might be relevant as we go through the case studies, which begin in the next slide. I apologize to those of you who are already familiar with these. There is a scholar of DIY in the audience, so in particular, I apologize to you, Alice, to try to sum up DIY. But DIY, from an American perspective, DIY does not have the kind of garden center connotation that it has in the UK. For certain population of musicians, DIY is just, it is a kind of, anti-mainstream, independent way of getting started in the music business. And there is this kind of alternative infrastructure for music and musicians that exists, not just in the US, all around the world. particularly robust in the US and the UK and Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe. But it refers to this kind of like non-mainstream way of producing and consuming and performing music. So my band, and I should also say, by the way, if this wasn't already clear, there's a heavy autoethnographic component to what I am doing and have done, but I'm trying not to rely entirely on my own experience because it's not monolithic by any means. But anyway, my band did start out as in a DIY way. There's still DIY aspects to what we do because we're self-managed. But DIY is, of course, not just it doesn't just explain these processes, but it is also kind of a way of life or, a greater ideology that a lot of bands subscribe to. But there's a lot more to say about that. It's not really worth getting fully into, but DIY is going to come up probably. So a green room, that's an easy one. That is just the backstage area at a venue. But a green room is, you spend more time, frankly, in the green room than you do on stage. And it is the major kind of locus of hospitality for touring bands. So it's an important space to keep in mind. Per diem is obviously not a concept that is unique to music, but in our case, the per diem is what you are kind of allotted either by yourselves or by your tour manager. When you're on tour, the tour manager would be the kind of person who manages the logistics of your day-to-day activities on tour. In my bands, when we tour domestically, I'm the tour manager. And when we tour internationally, we usually have other people tour manage us, and they allot the per diems. In the US, we decide how much we get every day. It's usually not a lot of money. Buyout is what would be given to the band by the promoter at the venue for the express purpose of, that is the hospitality basically, is like some money to go get yourself some pizza or whatever it is. Catering happens when you reach a higher level of touring, when you're playing at an arena or, a bigger venue. They will generally have areas specifically for meals, and the bigger bands have to kind of get to venues really early in the day, so they'll actually eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the venue, and there's a specific area for that. Catering also at a festival, there would be like a tent usually, or a shipping container or something that would provide that. The promoter, I've already used this word. The promoter is the person in the locality who has put together the show. Sometimes they are tied to the venue where the show is, or sometimes they float around and put on shows at different venues. The rider is also a super important kind of expression of how we experience hospitality on the road, because it is what the bands put together kind of aspirationally and to kind of in hopes of getting, man, it's tough to describe what a rider is, but it's not a difficult concept. It's a sheet of paper that has a list of snacks on it that the band hopes to get from the venue. Or not just snacks, towels, socks, underwear, those sometimes show up on riders. And the image on this slide is a backstage spread in Prague. You can tell it's Prague because there's so many red bell peppers. But this was not, our rider is just usually just like some bananas, because if you eschew a big rider, then the venue does not spend all that extra money on snacks, and you get it in the form of a buyout, which you can then use to go buy your own food. Meal and drink tickets are the kind of lowest form of hospitality that we receive, because it's just a little ticket that gives you a beer basically, and that's kind of the best you can hope to get in the US usually. And I'm trying to breeze through these because really the term hospitality and the term house, it's really interesting how they are used in the touring world, because hospitality is a word that just shows up every day. And sometimes hospitality refers to all of these things that I just described. Sometimes there is a hospitality coordinator at a venue, and somebody will meet you at the door and say, okay, I'm your hospitality person, or I'm here to show you to the hospitality. Sometimes being shown to the hospitality means being shown to the green room, which sometimes is a super comfortable place to hang out. Sometimes it's the worst room you could possibly imagine. And sometimes hospitality only refers to food, and they will say, this is our budget for hospitality, or what are you guys thinking for hospitality, or what are you hoping to get for hospitality? So it's just a word that it comes up all the time. And then I've put the word house in quotations because usually venues in industry terminology are referred to as the house. So the doors to a venue are called the house doors. And when a show is about to start, someone will say, okay, when are we going to open the house doors? When are we going to let people into the house? So really, it is being presented as your home for the night. There's so many different levels of this. Like I just described with Anna Ramella's work, you know, the musician constructs their own house on stage. Within that little zone, you construct your own house within a song, sonically. But then also on kind of zoomed out, the venue for the night is your house, and it's constantly reinforced through the language that is used to describe it. It's also interesting because a lot of DIY bands start out playing shows literally at people's houses, those are called house shows. So, you know, my introduction to performing came at people's houses, and when you say it's time to open the house doors, it's actually somebody's house. But that language carries on to, you know, upper levels of this profession. I just think that's something also to keep in mind, because then you're talking about hosts and guests, right? The classic idea. And there are so many host-guest relationships swirling around at all times on tour. The venue hosting the band, the promoter hosting the band, the headlining band hosting the opening band, and even members within their own bands hosting each other, depending on if you're a cohesive 4-member unit or whatever, or if it's a band that has a front person where it's their main project and they've just hired other musicians to come along with them, they would be hosting you. And so this terminology of hospitality, your house, being hosted, being a guest, it is just every day, every activity kind of centers around there and grows from there. So all of this stuff to keep in mind, and now we're gonna get into some specific stories that, you know, my hope is that they start to reveal some of these themes, and like I keep saying, food is going to be the window into them. And I'm trying to stay conscious of time, and I'm trying to not talk for too long. So we'll see if I succeed in doing that. So I'm going to start by reading this quote. This is from a DIY musician who recounted to us the story of a performance in Ravenna, Italy. One night we were booked at a club in Ravenna, Italy called Mauve. It was Thanksgiving. Being from the South, missing Thanksgiving was a big deal. It's probably a big deal for most Americans, but convincing my mother it was worth it to miss Thanksgiving to play guitar in Europe was, for this redneck, a titanic deal. I don't remember everything I said on the mic. I do remember I was in the crowd by the third song, a record for that tour by a long shot. That's me at my best. That's me giving it my all. It was because of the food. It was because of the hospitality. Something my home state is arguably known best for. Hospitality. It goes a long way, and that night was no exception. I tell y'all all that to say this: if you take care of a band, the band will take care of you. It's that simple. My hopes, and anyone reading this, is that if you ever get the chance to be accommodating to a touring band, you won't regret it. Just simply show them the good stuff, the stuff they probably don't have where they're from. They'll reciprocate by showing you their art the way they want you to see it. It might work. So, as you can tell from the story, you know, this band, and this guy's from Mississippi, which is a US state that is indeed known for kind of embodying Southern hospitality. They play the show in Ravenna. He recounts being greeted at the door by the club owner, who knows that it's Thanksgiving, knows that that's difficult for them, and serves them this incredible meal of home-cooked Italian food that, as you can tell from from the rest of the story, gives them the fuel to really perform in a way that they might not have if the hospitality hadn't been so robust. So in this way, and one of the main things we're trying to tease out through this project, food and hospitality are the main kind of, they have such a huge effect on what the actual performance is like, and thus what the audience sees. And so from night to night, you know, what you as an audience member experience as a live performance, there are so many things that have happened in that day leading up to that performance. The performance is such a tiny sliver of what every day is for us, right? It's, you know, like 5% of the day. Everything else swirls around these host-guest relationships and rituals of hospitality. So depending on what those are like, the performance you get is completely different from night to night. And this is an interesting story because it's a case where I mean, he spells it out. The food and the hospitality are what made the performance great. The hospitality almost unlocked a level of performance that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And in that way, hospitality is kind of mediating the whole experience. And what's interesting is that a lot of time, and I have done this, I've spoken like this, and we've encountered this in so many people we've spoken to for this project. These types of experiences end up standing in for the whole day or for the show when musicians recount their experiences in a certain city. So, for example, if this person were to be asked about how was the show in Ravenna, you know, they start saying, well, Ravenna was so cool. The people are so nice. The food is so good. We felt so welcome. And of course, this is something that happens with leisure travelers, with anybody who travels, right? Little experiences will stand in for the whole, and generalizations might be made about what a certain culture's hospitality is like or not like. But what's interesting about when musicians do it is that really the whole reason we're there is to play music, but it ends up taking such a back seat to everything else that really what lives on in their memory and then what is then disseminated to the people they talk to about their experiences. It's not the show was amazing or, you know, the audience was amazing. It was a really warm welcome. They made us feel, you know, really at home, and the food was amazing. And I have told people about experiences on tour using these devices so many times. And we're always asked about, how was tour? How was this city? How was that city? The thing is, you're not really experiencing the city. This is going to come up in another case study, but you get these little snapshots, and what you hang on to generally would be the food and hospitality. And so he spells it out. Another thing I want to just touch on is that this is a smaller DIY band, and those bands have the agility and don't have to worry about the overhead so much, in such a way that they're able to tour in places like Ravenna. So this is a grunge musician from Mississippi performing in Ravenna, Italy, which I think, you know, that's these roots and these kinds of, which are well trodden, by the way. I mean, and I let the fire truck pass. I'm not gonna go too deep into this grand tour thing. I'm thinking about the grand tour, but there are these established roots that DIY musicians have blazed around the US, Western Europe, all over, actually. And I'm not sure how many people outside of the industry realize that actually the smaller your band is, the less well-known your band is, the greater kind of palette of those locations you have access to. Because once you get to a certain level of popularity, it's just not cost effective or possible to travel abroad so much. You have to then buy plane tickets for, you know, a 25-person crew or whatever it is. When you're just a 2-piece or a 4-person DIY band, yeah, you can go play that show in Ravenna. You're not going to make that much money, but you don't really have to worry about it. And so in that way, you have access to all of these places around the world. You're constantly asked about them. What do you remember? This is a completely different side of things. So this person is a pop musician, a mainstream musician, and this gets into body image stuff that I think is an incredibly important aspect of the impact the food has on our lives on tour. And I'll read this quote aloud too. So I think all artists do that. You eat the worst you could ever eat, hideous food. And then because your show runs 10 to 11, you're not eating a full meal till 12 to 1. So you eat horribly, you're gaining weight or you're losing way too much weight. And then you sleep in a tight spot. It's wild in Redacted. We had nobody to help us eat healthy on tour, but if you got fat, they gave you a call. In Redacted, it was even more extravagant because we were with Redacted's money. So we ate wealthy. We ate beautifully, right? He had a chef, so we ate what the chef cooked. And so he didn't have to worry about if he started gaining weight or he wanted us to lose weight because, oh, you're too skinny, you're too fat. He would just tell his chef. We would have protein shakes made. His chef would put him on a diet and he'd have grilled chicken instead of fried chicken. He was kind and we ate well, but if you came out of shape and you looked crazy, conversation would be had, and he'd send whoever he needed to send to make sure you were at the level you needed to be at. But there was no conversation of, okay, guys, we're going to make it a point that you're healthy and that we're eating 3 meals a day. No. So I think the image of a backstage, you know, bounty of, you know, abundant snacks, meals, whatever. And in this case, touring actually with a private chef, with a personal chef, which is a level of touring I haven't experienced firsthand. So it's just as interesting for me to hear about it. There is a real dissonance between the constantly available bounty, and yet there is also, in the case of this person was in a, what I think at the time would have been called a girl group, but a pop group. And then this was a prominent American rapper that they were touring with who had the private chef. There is just constantly microscope on the way you look and the way your body looks. And it not just performing, but a big part of touring is press engagements. So where photographs are being taken of you. And so there's this dissonance between, here's this huge, banquet of all this food. And yet if you don't look the right way, we're not going to be able to sell what we're here to sell, which is not just the music, but the way we look. So this is a huge part of touring for a lot of people. There is a gender element to this that I think needs to be explored. Definitely, people experience it differently. I think, cisgendered women, a lot of the burden falls on them to look a certain way, especially in the pop world, but it's true for trans women, trans men, cisgendered men, non-binary people. Everybody deals with the constant stress of body image on tour. And so eating and eating healthy, whatever that means to you, really becomes an enormous challenge. So you could have all the resources in the world, to have a private chef with you. It doesn't make it fun, certainly. It doesn't make it easier. It's actually more challenging because there's really not a lot of help at the pop level, what you see from this person, but also at lower levels where I'm at and DIY levels. There's no handbook for how to eat healthy. And when you're moving from city to city every night, it's really difficult to maintain any sort of routine, right? And yet at the same time, like I said, and like she's saying, you're constantly under the microscope. So this is something that I think, it's not really part of the public conversation about touring, and I think it needs to be. And as you can see, food is the way that this person chooses to communicate those issues, and I think it makes sense. This is kind of related. This deals with alcohol, which is of course a companion to food and forms a big part of what exists in the popular imagination about how musicians operate on tour. So this person says, we don't really drink much anymore on the road. That's how we've made it this long. There were days early on where we drank before a show, during a show, but we were younger. I feel like once 30 hit, it became difficult to drink and perform. And now that we're in our 40s and 50s, I have one drink and the performance is just not there. And that's why we're out there. I keep telling people, like, we're out here because this is our job. This is not us having fun and partying. And that's hard for people to realize, right? Because a lot of people think, even family members think, it's a party out on the road. And I'm like, no, this is my job. When you come to the show and say, hey, let's go grab dinner, and I can't go, you can't be upset with me, because it's like me coming to your work and being like, hey, let's go grab a drink in the middle of the day. But if we have a multi-night stay, count on me reaching out to a buddy who's a restaurateur or something and going and eating with him the next day for lunch. Food and beverage are so synonymous with one another. They just go so well together. And it's super difficult because I don't ever drink before a show. And if I do drink at all, it'll be a glass of wine after the show. That makes it a little challenging to have these super opulent meals, because you want to have that layer of experience, right? The beverage part of food and beverage is just as important when it's a chef that's trying to portray this artistic vision. So when we talk about myth busting, I think this quote goes a long way to do that. There's no question that there are musicians and bands who treat the question of alcohol consumption on tour differently than this, but their behavior will always catch up to them. And what I have experienced and what we have heard, again, from pretty much everybody we've spoken to for this project, which is about 40, 50 people from all different genres and eras of music, everybody across the board, relates back that once you hit a certain age, you just have to stop drinking. And that is, I think, one of the major misconceptions about touring. And it's tied inextricably to the mobile nature of what we do, because moving through the world just becomes so much harder if you're hungover. And that's a lifestyle that is reinforced to everybody and to musicians through pop culture and the more dominant narratives of what touring entails. But it's something that it's important to push back against. And so this is a this is an example, because this person loves food and wine, as you can tell from the second half of the quote. This is a person who appreciates alcohol on a higher level, appreciates wine. They seek out, special food experiences on tour when they can, but because the main reason for doing it is performing, they abstain. So I think this is valuable. Now we're really gonna switch gears here and talk about Pizzagate. So this is not an interview with the musician. And I wonder actually how many people outside of the US are familiar with Pizzagate, but basically this is a conspiracy theory that started in the 2016 election cycle. And it's centered around a pizzeria in Washington, DC that happens to also be an indie music venue, where a kind of precursor to QAnon started to assert that because Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, John Podesta, was an investor in this restaurant, that there was a secret satanic child sex trafficking ring operating out of the pizzeria. And this caught so much steam and snowballed so much that there was, and this is the news story from what happened. Oh, whoops. Oh dear. Somebody actually, an adherent to this conspiracy theory, drove to the pizzeria, showed up with a rifle and opened fire. And luckily nobody was hurt. He shot into a closet, but he was trying to expose the child sex ring that he thought existed because of the conspiracy theory. And this was a huge thing in the 2016 election. And a lot of people on the left kind of laughed it off, like, oh, these people they're just crazy. This is never gonna turn into anything. Well, what it turned into is what you saw on January 6th. And this was really, this should have been a warning signal to our country that things were really headed in a nasty direction. What's so interesting is that I had always thought, and I think a lot of my peers always thought, these fringe people, and by the way, not really that fringe anymore in the US, sadly, but these fringe people, they're never going to really intersect in our lives. We're indie musicians, how are we ever going to be in the same place at the same time with these folks? They don't come to our shows. We don't really perform in the places where, where they proliferate or whatever. But the entire conspiracy theory centers on a venue that I have performed at multiple times. It is a family-friendly venue in Washington, DC. It is actually one of the only all-ages venues in DC, meaning that people under 18 can attend. And they serve the band's pizza backstage, and it's one of very few venues in the US that feed you. That is something that happens, and there's another quote later that deals with this. That's something that happens all over the world, but really doesn't happen in the US, and it's really rare when venues feed bands. And not only that, the pizza happens to be very good. So bands are always very excited to play at Comet Ping Pong. And the way that they show hospitality to us is through pizza. However, this same symbol, the pizza, that represents warmth and hospitality to us, the people who perform there, to a frighteningly large segment of Americans, the pizza represents a front for a wild conspiracy theory. And here you have the intersection of what's going on in contemporary American politics with, strangely, indie bands who tour and who are happy to receive pizza as hospitality on the road. So the question then becomes, who gets to define what this space is? Do we get to have our definition of this is a space of wonderful hospitality as symbolized by the pizza, which is so rare in the US? Or is it the conspiracy theorists who get to define the space? And unfortunately, after this attack, the venue was shut down for several months. They've since reopened, and I think they're going to start having shows again once it's safe to do so. But suddenly this is something that's on our minds when we perform, What is going to keep us safe from the next person who decides to show up there with a rifle and investigate the conspiracy theory? Which again, it is centered around pizza to the degree where it is called Pizzagate. So I think this is a super interesting example of everything that we're working on crashing into everything that's going on in our country right now. And like I said, this was 2016. So things escalated even further in 2020. And the Pizzagate conspiracy theory specifically kind of petered out during the Trump years. But then it kind of, during the 2020 election, it started coming back up again. And I've read recently that the Pizzagate stuff is proliferating once again. So it's something to keep our eyes on. And sadly, for touring musicians, these types of things are ever present for us. And again, food brought us there. And so this is another example that isn't straightforward quote from an artist. This is from a festival. I'm now noticing the really haphazard way that I decided to structure this just kind of random case studies. But anyway, this is an interview with a person who runs a music festival in Montreal that is really well known for having wonderful food for the artists backstage. And I'll read the quote and then we can talk about what it means for a second. Food is such an important part of your day. And if you start the day off with good coffee and good food, then no matter what happens after that, your day is going to be better. You're going to be nicer to the sound guys. You're going to be nicer to the security people. Montreal is the food capital of Canada. And we really wanted to make that statement to the artists who were coming through town that this is a food city. And we wanted that to be part of the experience. We always thought that if we provided that kind of experience, we knew that in order for the festival to work, one of the best ways would be to get the bands talking about it. I think the good thing about what we've done is that it pushed other festivals to try and up their game as well. And if that works out for the entire industry, where artists are treated a bit better when it comes to food, then this whole experiment has been valuable on that level. We're curating everything as if you would be walking into one of our restaurants. You guys are on tour and it's a crazy weekend. You don't have an extra day off in Montreal, so we're trying to give you Montreal within those few hours. We're trying to give you that experience. So this backstage area at the festival is kind of like a who's who of Montreal restaurants. Sadly, I haven't gotten to play at it. Alex has, and all of Montreal's culinary specialties are kind of represented. And it was super interesting to hear from the organizers that was one of the goals of their festival, because usually what the bands eat, as I think has been underscored, is, well, with the exception of the Ravenna story, what the bands eat generally is kind of an afterthought. And yet, as I said earlier, we're constantly asked about how is this city, how is that city, how is Montreal, what was what was it like, what was the food like? But these people are actually saying, literally, we are going to give you Montreal. And what that means is that the foods that Montreal is known for end up being symbols that stand in for Montreal itself, or I guess you could use the word synecdoches for Montreal. So the poutine you have backstage, the pastrami sandwich, the bagel, you are then being invited by the festival organizers to consume their city, which to their mind is the fastest route to understanding a little something about the city that's hosting you. And I think that kind of awareness is rare, and I wasn't expecting to encounter it in our research, but I think it's heartening to know that that bands are kind of being allowed to inhabit that role of a tourist in this case, because usually we're not. So yeah, I think thinking about, also so much has changed since I was working on culinary tourism several years ago, where now, and at the time I didn't even have social media, but now this concept of food standing in for not just a city, but a country, and not just a country, but that country or that city's history. And all of in the case of Montreal, all of the waves of immigration that have shaped what the city is today, the fastest route to it, what we're learning, is to consume it. So you have the bagel, you understand a little piece of Jewish immigration flows to Montreal. You have the piri-piri chicken, you understand a little bit about the Portuguese imprint on Montreal food culture, and thus Montreal culture writ large. You have wood-fired pizza. These are all things, by the way, that are backstage at this festival. You understand a little bit about the contribution of Italians, Lamajun, falafel, hummus, the North African and Lebanese impact on Montreal, ditto. So all of those things, and poutine, the French impact on Montreal. You are being invited to consume all of those ideas and all of that history through these representative foods. And this is something that the festival organizers in this case are thinking about. And having played many other festivals that are not this one, I can tell you that that is really not the case across the board. But their idea that, you know, setting kind of a best practices that other festivals might be able to follow, I think is great. And I really hope other festivals learn from it, because our experience can only be enriched the more we interact with those stories and those histories in the cities that we visit. Okay, there's only a few more here. This is kind of a colorful story. Our experiences, this is actually the same person who did that first quote that I showed. You could probably tell from the language. Our experiences of a promoter feeding us after a show is such an Asian thing, it's a European thing, it's an African thing, but it's not an American thing. Maybe at the DIY level, you're gonna get fed, but generally speaking, the idea that a promoter is gonna feed you after a show in the United States, are you effing kidding me? No effing way. Our tour manager, and this story takes place in Japan, our tour manager was so polite that even though he knew what was in store, because of my insistence, he relented. I think just mentioning that there will be food later tonight was his version of making it clear that there's a very big surprise in store. But of course, I'm a stupid American and I'm like, nah, I gotta eat. But we were being wined and dined. We were guests of honor. The generosity, the elegance and grace of that generosity was permeating that space, and we felt like the belles of the ball. I mean, we really felt cared for and loved, and that is the rarest thing on tour. Man, is that rare. So this story is about, basically they're on tour in Japan and the promoter tells them, don't eat before the show because the venue is gonna feed you. And in this case, they were performing at a Buddhist temple in Kanazawa. So this person who is familiar both with Japanese food culture and with Buddhism and temple cuisine kind of thought, that's really nice, you know, it's wonderful hospitality, but my experience has told me that this is probably going to be like just a little brown rice and some tea. And I know that what I need to perform is something different. So he goes and gets conveyor belt sushi before the show, ruins his appetite. And then sure enough, it's a great feast that meets him after the show. He was completely wrong. And he didn't ruin the experience for himself, but he altered it. And this is really representative of a phenomenon that happens on tour all the time, which is kind of, do you trust the people who are providing hospitality for you? And is it the mobility, is it our status as mobile, you know, professionals that fosters a kind of mistrust, because it's so important for us to construct these comfortable spaces for ourselves, and some sort of consistency in food is one of the only ways to do that. You know, there have been examples in my own life of trusting the promoter and having that backfire. They really either don't feed you or don't feed you well. And there have been the opposite. You know, you trust the promoter and things work out pretty well and you get, you know, a very special experience. But like this person is saying, it's so rare that there is this tendency among touring musicians to mistrust promoters when they tell you that they're going to take care of you. And I think that's a fascinating phenomenon. Why, you know, and I'm not generally, if I was traveling for leisure, I wouldn't behave that way, but some switch flips in my head and in other people's heads when you're traveling in this way. And there's almost this self-preservation, and like this same person referred to tour as survival mode. It's like, I have to make sure all my basic needs are met, and do I trust this person to provide that for me? Because at the end of the day, everything is leading up to a performance, right? And that performance is going to be affected by all these other things. So, but this is an interesting story because his you know, tendency to mistrust the promoter backfired, and he didn't have his full appetite for what would have been an unforgettable meal at the temple. Okay, I think this is the second to last one. So this is another interesting one. This is a band that's from Alaska, which just, you know, that's interesting to begin with. There are not that many bands from Alaska. So this person says, we do band and crew. That's always been our deal since the beginning of this band. The band and crew all eat together. And that's something that's really important for us. Growing up in Alaska and then working in construction, you're so used to being with a crew. I mean, my family, we were in the middle of nowhere. My parents were dog sled mushers. I had verified this independently. His parents were dog sled mushers. So there were points where we were in a cabin and it was just us, like a one-room cabin taking baths in a tin trough. And I think I might force kind of a family vibe a lot of the time because you get so used to your pack and being together. One thing that I will always remember was one of our first tours, we went out to eat food at the same restaurant, like we were at a Denny's together, and the headliners took our check and paid for it when we had no money. That forever made an impact on me. That was this really special thing that headliners have done for us in the past. We do that as well. So in addition to the band and crew eating together, openers on tour, if they're there, if they're around when we're going out to get food, if we see them at the restaurant, it's usually taken care of. So there's a few things going on in this. And the photo here, I haven't been referencing the photo, but the photo here is of, our crew all eating together before a show in Zagreb where the promoter took us to a local restaurant. And not just the band, but the band, the promoter, our crew, and the venue's crew all sat down to a big meal together. And that happens all the time in Europe, in Asia, and in Australia, New Zealand. It really does not happen in the US at all. But the symbolism and the spatial symbolism of all sharing a meal and sitting at the same table before the performance is hugely important. And again, I haven't been making these anthropological references throughout this, but here, if I were to begin putting together a bibliography, you could look at Bourdieu and symbolic power and all of that sort of stuff as you try to view it through one of those lenses. The symbolism of the shared table is huge. And then another thing that happens, and this person didn't talk about this in this quote, although in our interview he talked about it. Sometimes this meal, this is a thing, especially in France, but sometimes this meal actually takes place like in the venue, in the space where the audience later stands. So a huge dinner table is brought into what is called the house floor. And you set up there and have dinner in the same space where only a couple hours later, the audience will be there watching you perform. And so the space kind of plays a dual role. But this kind of dismantling of those power structures and the egalitarian aspects of band and crew being treated as equals and doing that through food, through sharing a meal together, what is obviously the most kind of ancient expression of doing that, is such a feature of touring abroad. And this is a band, the Alaskan band, that chooses to also do it in the US, which is very unique. They also talk about bringing a commercial hot dog roller on tour with them, like the kind that you see in a gas station in the US, and setting it up in their backstage area so that their crew and the openers can always kind of come and grab food from them. And that's also super rare. And they're showing their appreciation and they're showing their values really through having the food accessible to everybody, no matter what kind of level of the project they're at. The levels actually don't exist. And that's why I titled this slide, Erasing Hierarchies of Hospitality. It is a non-hierarchical view of who gets to access what hospitality. And generally on tour, those boundaries are very tightly enforced. You'll have separate green rooms from the opening band, or the crew, especially in the US, the crew will have their own little horrible room to go have dinner in, but in these cases, everybody together, everybody sharing food, it tells you a lot. And it tells you a lot about, how European countries generally view the arts versus how the US views the arts. And at some of these venues in France where you'll eat on the actual house floor, it's a pretty common feature for them to have chefs on staff who cook for the bands. And bands generally tend to make, in our case, make more money than we feel that we're worth at these shows, because they tend to have government funding, and the government funding is, I think, largely used, in addition to paying the bands, it's used for the hospitality, it's used to buy the ingredients, and it's used to employ the chef who works at the venue. And so those ideals are expressed through food. The funding goes to it. It tells you a lot about, and it's no secret how French culture venerates food, obviously, but to see it expressed even at the level of a concert, of a rock concert, even if you're at a venue where, and sometimes in our case, 15 people show up to see you, but you still get served like duck confit beforehand. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And that's something that really makes an impact, makes an impression on the American artists who get to tour abroad. And every American artist that we speak to for this project, their mind tends to first go to Europe, to Western Europe, because of this. When we ask them, what are some kind of resonant or interesting food experiences we've had on tour, people's minds really tend to go straight to France, straight to that shared table. I mean, because it is just so different than what we experience here. Conversely, what's interesting is that European artists we've spoken to tend to kind of romanticize the US gas station or the US rest stop. And those aspects of touring that to us are really, represent why touring in the US is so much less hospitable in our mind. But because of the romanticization of that imagery throughout history, I think, they experience it differently. But that could be, and in fact, this slide could really be its own chapter or its own book, really, because there is just so much to discuss here. But I'll leave it there. Also, I just think, this band's Alaskan background is super interesting. And this idea of having a construction background and a working class background, and that informing the way that they treat band crew relations, which again, another one of those host-guest relationships, the way that they treat those relationships based on their Alaskan upbringing, it's unique. The class structures that are usually held up in the music industry have been written about plenty. One of the people in the audience, Ellis, has written about it. There's a lot of homogeneity among indie musicians, and generally indie musicians come from a somewhat more well-off background because it means they can afford to work for no money while their band is becoming more well-known and before their band is profitable. This band upends that, and actually, this is a super popular pop group in the U.S. and they started off really DIY, and they have this working class background, and they have brought those ideals with them all the way up to where they are now. And we're at the last one here, I believe. This is getting into the sensory. So this is a story this person tells about the way that a tour van smells while you're on tour because of all the food that accumulates in it. And I'm ending with, I'll explain why I'm ending with this one, but I think it'll be clear, at least to people who have been at other Xenia lectures throughout this time. So this person says, I didn't actually mind the smell while eating or even right afterwards. The moment of disgust came upon re-entry after being out of the van for a while. The particular way the lingering smell hit me when I got back in. About a month ago, my daughter had a doctor's appointment, and across the street from the office is a McDonald's. We have a deal that if she has to get a flu shot or any other needles during her checkup, we'll go to McDonald's afterwards for French fries. Because of COVID, eating them there wasn't an option, so this time we got the fries to go, and not wanting them to get soggy or cold, we enjoyed them in the car on the way home. The next time I got in the car, I was greeted by the familiar smell of French fries, still lingering as it does, and I almost couldn't bring myself to leave. When I did, I went inside and texted my bandmates about how much I missed them. This is not an interview excerpt. This is actually from a written essay that somebody submitted for our project. So smell, memory, the senses, the sensual, all of this getting unlocked by this memory that it's kind of gross. The way your van starts smelling on tour from the mixture of fast food or gas station snacks, it really accumulates. This is a musician who then ended up touring in tour buses. So they were kind of reminiscing on what it was like before they were in a tour bus and when they were in a van. But his whole essay is about how gross that smell is and how much he hated it when it was happening, how he couldn't stand when his bandmates would eat in the van because he just knew that it would make the van smell so bad. But the reason they ate in the van was because of this tightly regimented schedule. If you don't eat in the van, then you're not going to get to the venue on time, and you're not going to get to construct the home for yourself on stage so that you're comfortable. So you have to, by necessity, eat in the van, and then it ends up smelling. But this is a case where that, in retrospect, it ends up kind of shifting. And I think it's kind of a beautiful essay, even though it's about sort of a gross subject, in particular, thinking about stale McDonald's French fry smell in a vehicle, that it could evoke this kind of Proustian moment is kind of funny and kind of unexpected. And I think, once again, if I was going to kind of start thinking about other reference points for this in the world of anthropology or other bibliographical references, I think we could bring up Tom Kanafani, although it's much less kind of romantic than a Emirati, incense ritual, but similar ideas, right? Sarah Bonfanti, who spoke earlier, right, has done a lot of work on the anthropology of smell and odor, what that all evokes for us. This can be tied to that. And then also there is an Edensor work on memory in haunted spaces, specifically haunted spaces, but there's, this isn't supernatural, but there is something haunted about your old tour van and the way that those memories are unlocked through smell that I think is relevant and could be picked apart. Again, this is something that I think could have its own really longer chapter. And none of these stories really are the straight ahead kind of romantic view of touring that I think is generally perpetuated. There's a lot more going on under the surface. And so I hope some of these case studies have peeled the curtain back a little bit into that. I did just put this triangle sandwich thing at the end because this is just talk about haunting. This is something that kind of haunts me when I think about my experiences touring. Yeah, those are the case studies that I thought to share. I have been rambling a bit, but I hope that there is a clear thread between them. I think that there is, of how food can help us expose greater truths about what it's like to move through spaces like this. And then the interesting thing about what we do is we distill all of those experiences ultimately, and we perform at the end of the day, and that's what sets apart what we do from how other people, other travelers experience similar phenomena. But I wonder if any of these stories have brought up memories or reference points for any of you. And I guess with that, I will conclude this portion and we can open it up for a discussion.